Imagine a weapon that never needs to refuel, can circle the globe, and shows up where you least expect it. That's the image Russia wants you to picture when it talks about the 9M730, also called Burevestnik, NATO name, Skyfall. The claims are big. Limitless reach, unstoppable power. Russian leaders have boasted about it, and a high-level military voice even warned it could be a flying Chernobyl. Sounds terrifying, but the real story is messier and way less impressive than the headlines make it seem. The idea behind Burevestnik is simple to explain. Instead of carrying a big load of fuel, the missile would have a tiny nuclear reactor on board that heats the air rushing through its engine. That hot, fast air pushes the missile forward, so in theory, it could fly much longer and farther than normal rockets. Engineers call this type of engine a nuclear ramjet. On paper, that gives a military a scary tool. One that could travel thousands of miles, dodge defenses, and even hang around the sky for hours before striking. This idea isn't new. It goes back to Cold War projects when superpowers were dreaming up very odd weapons. The United States once built and tested parts of a similar program in the 1950s and 1960s, Project Pluto and the SLAM concept, and then stopped because the experiments were dangerous and unpredictable. Russia's program traces its roots to Soviet-era plans too, but it was revived in the post-Soviet years and pushed hard after 2000 as a kind of do-over with modern funding. If the concept sounds tempting, that helps explain why Russia kept throwing money at it. A nuclear-powered cruise missile would be a huge deterrent if it worked. Anywhere, anytime reach, hard to stop, and terrifying if it carried a nuclear warhead. For leaders who want to show strength, that's attractive. But turning the dream into a reliable weapon is a different story. Real life keeps getting in the way. Tests of the system have reportedly failed more than once. Instead of clean demos, there have been explosions, technical meltdowns, and even incidents that raised radiation alarms in testing areas. That pattern, bold claims followed by messy, dangerous trials, undermines the whole idea of a dependable superweapon. Engineers can talk about range and flight profiles all day, but if the thing can't be tested safely and repeatedly, it's not a useful tool on the battlefield. Technically, a nuclear ramjet raises big problems. Packing a reactor into a small airframe while keeping it stable is extremely hard. Controlling heat and shielding the rest of the missile from radiation is tricky. And even if you solve the engineering puzzles, there's the safety question. What happens if the missile crashes or the reactor fails? A single accident could spread radioactive material over a wide area, a risk that turned off US planners long ago and still haunts every test program today. Politically and strategically, the missile's value is also doubtful. An unpredictable, risky weapon can spook friends and enemies, but that isn't the same as a reliable, controllable deterrent. If tests injure workers or contaminate testing grounds, the political blowback can be huge. Meanwhile, conventional missile technology and modern missile defenses keep improving, so the promise of an invincible weapon looks more like a public relations headline than a battlefield fact. So where does that leave Burevestnik now? It's been through long development, high promises, and messy trials. Russia touts record-distance test flights when it wants to show progress, but underneath those announcements are years of technical trouble and safety scares. The result is a weapon that, depending on which part of the story you believe, is either a game-changer or a dangerous experiment that keeps failing. Let's start with how the program began. Let's rewind to the 1950s, when the US tried something that sounds like a mad science movie. A plane and missile powered by a tiny nuclear reactor. Bright engineers at the time, people like Frankie Rahm and Eldon W. Sams, were poking at the idea of a nuclear ramjet, and the Atomic Energy Commission was wondering if a nuclear upper stage could push missiles farther than anyone had dreamed. On January 1st, 1957, those ideas jumped off paper and into Project Pluto. Scientists at the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory in Berkeley were told to build a real, working nuclear ramjet, the heart of a supersonic, low-flying missile nicknamed SLAM. This wasn't a small lab tinkering project. It needed whole new fortress-like facilities just to be safe enough to try. They built thick-walled test buildings, one called Building 2201, lighted viewing windows, a fallout shelter nearby, and even a private railroad to move the heavy radioactive test pieces. The site had to be perfect because one mistake with a live nuclear reactor could have been catastrophic. The construction alone cost about $1.2 million back then, roughly $12 million in today's money. Engineers did manage to build 2 test reactors. Tory 2A ran in May 1961, and a much larger Tory 2C was tested in May 1964. Those engines actually worked, a big technical win. But success in the lab wasn't the same as a green light to deploy a weapon. By July 1st, 1964, Project Pluto was canceled. Three big reasons killed it. First, ICBMs, conventional rocket-launched intercontinental missiles, had gotten a lot better and faster. If a weapon can reach anywhere on Earth in minutes, you don't need a slow, low-flying nuclear-powered cruise missile. Second, the safety problem was huge. The designs had unshielded reactors, and tests showed the engine would spew deadly fission byproducts, things like cesium-137 and iodine-131, right into the air. A flying reactor could spread radiation along its whole route, contaminating land, water, and people. That made finding anywhere safe to test or use the thing nearly impossible. Third, the whole program was just wildly risky. Packing a reactor into a missile created unpredictable engineering and safety headaches that leaders weren't willing to accept once better, cheaper, and safer alternatives existed. Picture a flying bomb with a suitcase-sized nuclear heart. Terrifying, hard to stop, and also wildly unsafe. Russia dug up that old dream and revived the Burevestnik, a nuclear-powered cruise missile. But what sounds like a superweapon quickly turned into a string of disasters. The US once tried the same trick and quit. Project Pluto showed how brutal the engineering is. Reactors in tiny airframes face neutron damage that eats metal, electronics that glitch from radiation, and fuel systems that corrode from intense particle streams. Those problems make the machine fragile, expensive, and unreliable, and make crashes into populated or natural areas a nightmare. When Moscow restarted the program, those same problems followed. Tests reportedly failed again and again. Rockets nosedived after minutes of flight, veered off course or lost power, and sank into seas and lakes. Each crash risked spreading radioactive bits, tritium, cesium, and other isotopes, into water, ice, and soil, harming animals and people and leaving long-lasting pollution behind. Building and testing a flying reactor isn't like testing ordinary engines. You need shielded buildings, special railways, thick concrete, and trained crews who can handle radiation. Even then, a single fault can poison a test site for years. That's partly why the US pulled the plug decades ago and switched to faster, safer ICBMs, rockets that reach targets quickly without dragging a reactor across the sky. Costs climbed as problems piled up. Materials cracked from neutron bombardment, circuits failed, and maintenance became a constant gamble. Russia kept funding the project for prestige and deterrence, a weapon that might scare other countries. But money can't fix physics or the real danger of a radioactive crash. There are also human costs. Reports tie the program to fatal accidents and radiation exposures, and local communities near test ranges have warned about contamination. Official statements downplay incidents, but the pattern of failed flights, lost hardware, and environmental damage paints a picture of a risky gamble with real victims. Public shows and grand announcements tried to spin the missile as unstoppable. Leaders displayed animations and claimed successful trials, promising a weapon that could skirt defenses and fly forever. But flashy claims don't erase the messy test records. Short flights, explosions, lost reactors, and repeated safety alarms that keep the program far from a clean, reliable reality. Picture a metal bird powered by a tiny nuclear heart meant to fly forever, but instead leaving a trail of danger and broken promises. That's the story Russia sold the world about Burevestnik, a missile that, if the talk is true, could fly for ages without refueling. In speeches, it sounded like a miracle. In reality, it kept tripping over the same deadly problems that sunk earlier projects. The Kremlin said tests proved the engine reached its design power and that a whole new class of strategic weapon was now possible. The claim was simple and bold. The reactor worked, the ground checks passed, and the world should get used to a missile with almost unlimited range. Yet behind the fanfare, the hardware was still fragile and unreliable, barely ready to leave the ground when the leader made his big announcements. Wait a second. If you are new to this channel and you like what you see and hear, please subscribe, like, and join the conversation below. If you're not convinced yet, subscribe and tell us how we can earn that click. We're all about getting better together. Let's move on. On August 8th, 2019, that fragile reality turned fatal. At a naval test range near Neonoxa on the White Sea, ships tried to lift a crashed prototype from the seafloor. During recovery, a liquid fuel booster attached to the missile's nuclear core exploded as it met the air. The blast killed 5 technicians instantly, and reports later suggested 2 or 3 more died from radiation-related illnesses, bringing the death toll to about 7. Witnesses and medical reports described horrifying symptoms: skin tissue dying away, severe bleeding from the gut, and organs failing. Others present at the scene, including rescuers and medical staff, were not told the true nature of the accident and ended up exposed to dangerous doses of radiation. Some showed signs of acute radiation sickness, like nausea, burns, and worrying changes in their blood tests. The explosion also scattered radioactive dust across the area. Scientists detected isotopes such as strontium-91, barium-140, and lanthanum-140 in the fallout. Gamma radiation readings spiked in nearby towns, including Severodvinsk, about 19 miles away, worrying residents and contaminating local environments. Wildlife, ice, and seawater all took a hit, consequences that can last for years. When families grieving at the scene wanted answers, official reactions were cold. Putin's public posture remained focused on the project's strategic value, not on the human cost. According to accounts, he pushed on with development and even told bereaved relatives that the work would continue. That insistence on pursuing the program despite the deaths stirred anger and fear among those closest to the victims. Months later, on October 26th, Putin and General Valery Gerasimov claimed the missile had flown some 14,000 kilometers on an Arctic test, a headline-grabbing number that suggested a breakthrough. Putin said experts once called the idea impossible, but now the key objectives had been met, and the military would start figuring out how to use and house this new system. It was a triumphant tone that clashed sharply with the program's messy testing history. Gerasimov's comparison of the missile to a flying Chernobyl added a chilling echo to the whole affair, referencing the worst nuclear disaster in modern memory. The phrase captured the fear, a weapon that not only could kill with its warhead, but might also spread radioactive contamination if anything went wrong, and it had already done so. When news of Russia's so-called flying Chernobyl hit global headlines, the reaction from defense experts was swift and scathing. Around the world, nuclear analysts called it reckless, unnecessary, and deeply dangerous, a throwback to a Cold War nightmare that should have stayed buried. Jeffrey Lewis, a well-known non-proliferation researcher at Middlebury College, summed it up bluntly. This is a bad development, another science fiction weapon that will only destabilize things and complicate arms control. His warning echoed across policy circles, not just about the weapon's danger, but about the message behind it. A country willing to gamble with radiation and global security to look strong. Chuck Farrar, a former U.S. Navy SEAL Team 6 squadron leader, was even harsher in the Kiev Post. He called Burevestnik a Frankensteinian folly, describing it as a desperate stunt by a regime losing on the battlefield and struggling under sanctions. To him, it wasn't a strategic breakthrough, it was a radioactive relic, a monster reborn at the cost of lives and legacies. Farrar pointed out that the missile's unshielded nuclear core makes it unworkable and environmentally catastrophic, especially in the fragile Arctic, where melting ice could spread radioactive particles across oceans and food chains. Then came the political response, bold and blunt. Aboard Air Force One, former U.S. President Donald Trump dismissed the hype outright. They know we have a nuclear sub, the greatest in the world, right off their shores, he said, adding that the U.S. doesn't need to build an 8,000-mile missile to prove its strength. He criticized Putin's obsession with showy weapons, saying Russia should focus on ending its war, one that should have taken a week but is now dragging into its fourth year. Trump's message was clear. The United States isn't intimidated. With an unmatched nuclear arsenal, cutting-edge missile technology, and submarines quietly patrolling global waters, America already holds overwhelming power. The Burevestnik, by contrast, looks less like a symbol of strength and more like a desperate attempt to distract from Russia's failures, especially as its forces continue to stumble in Ukraine. And so, what Putin likely intended as a display of dominance has instead exposed a different image to the world. A leader clinging to dangerous nostalgia, touting broken weapons while his army falters, and mistaking spectacle for strength.